Hey out there, everyone. Gavin Seim with Seim Effects and Photographic School. Today I want to talk a little bit about zone scales. What I'm going to show you today is very powerful, and it's especially for the owners of our exposed workshop. But if you don't have it, don't worry. You can still head over to Seim Effects, go to the exposed page, and you can actually watch a primer on zones, and you can also download for free a basic zone scale that we'll be talking about today. In Exposed, we talk a lot about zones. We talk about everything exposure, but we talk about how zones are the language of light. Now, sadly, zones are not taught much today in relation to digital. People say, well, they're old, they're for black and white, they're for film, etc. No, zones are for everything. Zones are for digital, black and white, film, you name it. And if you're not using zones in your visualization and your exposures, you're missing out because they're so incredibly powerful. Yes, zones are a system, the zone system. And there was a system in there for film developing and making prints and all that stuff that goes back to the darkroom days. But the fundamentals of zones in helping us understand and expose better are absolutely relevant to digital, and they're incredibly powerful. It gives us the ability to not only communicate the shades of light to dark from black all the way to white, but to use that in our exposures, because a zone is a stop. So we can spot meter. We can then say, all right, I spot metered. And if I spot meter, let's say on this couple's face, and then do just what the spot meter says, they're going to come out middle gray, because that's what meters default to. So that's something we get into in a lot more depth in the exposed videos, so check those out. But in particular today, we're releasing an extra for exposed owners. And this is something I put together to have zone guides here on the computer so that we can use those, we can print those as helpers, but we can also use them right on the images that we're using to help us better understand our tones and see what's going on in the image. Now, these are zone scales, and these are different zone scales that come with the exposed extras. If you have exposed, you should have received an update to this, or if you've purchased it after this came out, it will be included in your extras in your download. Bottom line is, these are all zone scales. You see zone 0 all the way to zone 10. So just real quick, for people not familiar with zones, zone 0 is pure black, zone 10 is pure white, clipped, okay? Zone 5 is middle gray. Middle gray, or 18% gray, or whatever you call it, that's what meters default to. So if you use a spot meter and do exactly what it says, I'm not talking about computerized averaging meters. I'm talking about being in control of your exposure. If you use a spot meter, you're going to default to that middle gray. Well, once you know that, once you meter that way, you can then look at an image and you can say, where do I want to put that tone? How bright should the face be? Now, what I've done with these is I've actually made a set of actions that will build these instantly in Photoshop and overlay them over your image. So it's good to have a printed scale, all that kind of stuff. But what I've done is we have 4 different kinds. I have the traditional zone scale with the Romans. I have the traditional zone scale with numbers, the gradient zone scale, which rather than the blocks goes all the way from black to white completely as a gradient. And then I have my favorite one, which is my super zone scale, and it has these little arms coming off of it that will allow us to kind of get in there and look at the nooks and crannies of an image and see where the different tone values are in an image. Okay, so let's go here, for example, and I'm just going to open up the actions palette, and I have these loaded. I actually have them in button mode. So there's normal mode. I have the zone actions loaded, and I just like button mode because all I got to do is one click. Now, here's the beauty. All I need to do with these actions, I don't have to load files or anything. Files of the zone scales are included in the download. But for the in Photoshop versions, just click the button. It's going to build the zone scale, and then it's going to drop it right onto our image. And so let's take a look at this here. I can move this around. What does this do for us? Well, here's black to white, so we can see where our values are. This doesn't inherently change anything in our image. This is really a way for us to better understand exposure. And as you study zones more and exposure more and get into exposed, you'll know exactly why this is useful. Because I can take an image and look around and analyze and think about how my visualization was, what I was seeing in my head. And the reason I love my little super zone scale here is I can zoom in and I can actually have these little bars coming out and see, hey, this is all the way down to zone 0 or black. And I can use this, even though this image is color. Zones don't really see color. They don't see black and white. A zone is a level of brightness. It's a level of exposure. So each zone is a stop. And this is incredibly powerful, what you can do with these. And so I can just study where my zones are. So perceptibly, we look at this and we see white. But in fact, there is no pure white here. Look at the level of contrast on the pure white. There is a lot of control of the tone in this image. There's no clipping, and except maybe in the blacks a little bit. Now, typically when I'm making an image, and this is preference, but rarely do you want clipped whites or zone 10. Because when you print those, there's actually, especially if you're digital printing, there's no ink there. It's just a blank space. Usually you don't want to clip your whites. Occasionally I'll have slightly clipped blacks if I want really richness, especially in black and white images and things like that. Okay, so let's look at another image and talk about how we can study this. Let's just go to this one. This is a favorite of mine that I made in Yosemite. And let's just go in and build the zone scale again. And again, I don't have to load a file or anything. I'm just clicking the action. It's going to build it and drop it right onto my image. Now, I can do this same thing. I can study. I can see where I'm going to black. I can see where I'm, right down in here. You can see how as the little bars, this is why I like my little super zone scale here, as the little bars disappear, as they fade away, you're actually matching that zone. You really see, and you can visualize and see even better what's happening. So I can put these along here, and I can see, here's zone 1. I can help to better understand what's happening in my image. I can see here that up here, my sky is in zone 9, but there's not actually any zone 10. I don't want to go to that pure white. I want that richness. I may have a little bit of pure black, not much, but you see what I'm getting at here. So zones is something you do in camera. Zones is a way that you can understand light at a very fundamental level, and this is something we cover in Exposed, not just zones, but every aspect of exposure and how we can understand every facet of it so that we can get exposure and light perfect in camera. But zones, if you use that part of it, they're so powerful, and you can expose your images better. And I just wanted to put these together and put them out there for you guys so that you could better understand zones, so you could tinker with those values. And a lot of this comes down to visualization. If you understand what's in your image, if you understand the values, the light, the tone, how that relates to your space and position and line, and put all this stuff together, you can learn so much about this. These mountains appear black initially, but if you look here, they're not black, because the black, actually, you can see a little bit of contrast there. We're not quite clipping in this image. Bottom line is, I always want to understand my exposures. I can go back and I can say, all right, here's what I saw. I exposed this image and I wanted it to be in these zones. And then I can review how my finished image came out. I can study it in relation to zones and just understand the nuances. The more we understand what we're doing, how we're processing an image in our mind's eye, and how we're finishing that image, relating that to the real world, to zones, to ratios, to exposure, the more control, the more power we have. And if you're to the end of this video and you're like, well, I don't really know what you're talking about with zones, this doesn't make sense. If it doesn't make sense, it's only because you're not using zones. So at the very least, head over to Seim Effects and watch the primer video on zones from Exposed, and check out the entire workshop too, because there's nothing out there anywhere in the industry like Exposed that takes on exposure at every level and really helps us to understand it. The bottom line about taking time to take a helper like this and study zones deeper as we're working with our images, as we're fulfilling our visualization, as we're working on post-processing, is that the more we understand our exposure and our light and how it carries to our finished process, the better our images will become. So that is the cool little extra for you guys today. If you purchased Exposed in the past, you should have received an update email. If you didn't get that, just head over to the site, get in touch with us, and we will get you the update with the actions and the files and things like that. If you don't have Exposed, you can go check it out over at seimeffects.com. You can watch a primer on zones, and you can even download a basic zone scale to start playing around with this. Very powerful stuff. Once you understand exposure and zones and all the pieces that tie this together, everything changes. All right, guys, have a good one. Take care.